So we have with us Dr. Ingrid Faro, and she is the visiting professor of Old Testament at Northern Seminary and is also a teacher, speaker, and author. She has several focuses of study, including Biblical Hebrew, I'm going to mess this up, Pentateuch, and the poetic and wisdom literature. She is also devoted to helping people navigate suffering, evil, and abuse, and loves to see people transformed through understanding the dynamics of positive change that can emerge out of the deepest pain, shame, and problems. But she also went through a deep period of deconstruction. So I'll let her tell her own story, though. Please give Ingrid a warm Church welcome in the chat. Ingrid, off to you.
Thanks so much, Emma, and thanks everybody for inviting me and for having me. And I'm excited about this group because I myself, as Emma mentioned, gone through several times in my life where I really questioned, why in the world am I a Christian? Why am I believing in God? I quit going to church, a whole lot of things. So I'm going to give you a short version of my story, some of the highlights, and I'll look forward to questions. And there are no questions that are off limits. I pretty much every week I'm talking with former seminary students, old friends, new friends, pastors, former pastors who are really deconstructing their faith. Some who have left their faith, and some are all over the board. So I enjoy the conversation. So let me get with it. So again, I was the first one in my family to become a Christian. I was 16 years old. I had come to the conclusion that the only reason anybody is ever nice to someone is to get something from them. And that's really a pretty realistic perspective. It's sad when that happens in the church, but that's part of our story as well. And what changed my life is I met a college student, a young woman who, when I saw her, I saw in her eyes the love of God. And I knew I had met God through her, and that just changed everything. And God showed me my bitterness and my anger, and I really had a dramatic change in my life. I actually literally felt a root of bitterness being pulled out of me as I went home and just cried and wept that whole night. And so that it was a wonderful beginning. I had a very, very real encounter with a living God. And that became an important part of my story later on. I started out in a small group. It was the Jesus People days. So it was a while back, and we were seeing all kinds of miracles and exciting things happen. And it was a great, great beginning to a walk of faith. And but there were so many things I had never been told, and that I've discovered the church still so often doesn't tell, which is something that this group is doing. So here, this wild and crazy group of largely young people that were just loving God and going out and sharing love. We apparently were a little too wild, and it was part of a national movement. And so some people stepped in who thought that they needed to control this environment. And so basically they came in and installed a very strict hierarchy and patriarchy. And within a couple of years, a lot of the people had left. Everything changed. The joy, the happiness, the love, everything was pretty much gone. But I had been very much raised in an environment where you do what the authorities tell you and you don't question. And so I submitted to this stuff far too readily. And, they were quoting the Bible. They had lots of verses, like the one in Hebrews that says, obey those that have the rule over you. So that was, of course, one of their favorite ones. So unfortunately, I just went ahead and went along figuring, well, they're quoting the Bible, they must be right. And one of the things that they taught us also was that as a woman, basically, I was supposed to keep quiet in the church, wasn't even supposed to get an education. Well, I kind of rebelled a little bit against that when I was already in college and went on for a master's degree. But again, the only way I could be in ministry was to be married to someone in ministry. And so I ended up, there was, someone that was approved. He was studying to be a pastor. He had a third of the New Testament memorized. He was leading Bible studies and evangelistic crusades, and he could get up and give a 3-point sermon with hardly any preparation. Looked very impressive. And so, everybody told me, and I thought, okay, well, this must be the way that I will be involved in ministry, support him and so forth. But even 2 weeks before the wedding. He told me that he had been unfaithful and he kicked me, but I didn't have the chutzpah, have the guts to back out, because I had really been at that time engrossed in this system of strict hierarchy. So we got married, and of course, I didn't understand about abuse, but as any of you know who've been through that, and again, all kinds of spiritual abuse, there's all kinds of abuse, and it only gets worse unless a person is really called to account and has a dramatic change, which often doesn't happen. So of course, the violence escalated. Finally, after a few years, one day he broke my nose while I was driving the car. I dropped him off at home, took myself to the emergency room. They told me not to go home because they could see the imprint of a ring on my nose. So I finally called the pastor, and all the pastor said was, "Go home and love your husband." Click, that was it. So I went home, and of course things continued to escalate. And I didn't get out of that marriage until he tried to kill me. And then I heard God speaking in my heart again, "If you stay, you will die." At that point, even as he was choking me, I don't remember feeling any pain, and I really didn't want to stay in this life anymore. And so when I was alive, God actually sent someone to the house that rang the doorbell. He got up off of me, and there I was alive. And I was frankly very disappointed, because I did not want to stay in this world anymore. But there I was, and really not quite knowing what to do. Thankfully, found a counselor who started asking me questions that I didn't even know I could ask. I had been taught I could ask questions. And I remember the first thing she asked was, "Why did you stay?" And, I had finally escaped. It took me 6 months to plan my escape because he was tracking me everywhere that I went. But I finally did escape, and was able to get some counseling. And so that started a path to healing. But obviously I was pretty broken at that point. I had a master's degree. I was actually an associate professor of nutrition. So people looking at me wouldn't think that I had problems because I could put on the mask, like so many Christians do, as we know too well. They learn to put on the mask, show the happy face. But at that point, I'd quit going to church also, because there really didn't seem much point. And I had a few different positions in nutrition. And I remember frequently driving in my car and just crying. It was the one safe place that I could just cry, because sometimes I'd come home and be locked out of the house and I never knew what to expect. And I specifically remember a few times just saying, "I don't even know why I even believe in you, God. What have you done for me? There's no evidence that you do love me." But there was something inside. I knew I had encountered God, and I just couldn't let go, even though there was no rational reason for me to continue to believe in God at all. So I held on to my faith, but certainly with lots of questions, and wasn't part of any church at that time. And so I did remarry. The person that I remarried while I was still in hiding had been a former Vietnam veteran. He was older than I was. He had been a mercenary for 20 years. He had sparred with Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris, and I felt safe. That was very important to me at the time. He was a brand new believer. And so it wouldn't be the kind of thing that I would recommend to people, but again, I felt safe. And the one thing that we shared in common in our lives was a deep grief. And we had this wild and crazy idea as we met and talked that maybe there was a God who actually wanted us to be happy. And that was a brand new idea for both of us. I remember in my first marriage, my sister calling me once and asking me if I was happy. And I said, "What does that have to do with life?" And so here was this wild, crazy idea that maybe we could actually be happy. So we got married, and I'd never had children because I refused to bring children into that first marriage. He had never had children either. And so we decided, let's build a home. It was just this beautiful dream. Let's build this beautiful dream. Maybe we're going to actually build a happy home and try to have a happy life. And he and I started to go to church again. And there was a good pastor who was just really kind. And he would spend hours just talking with his pastor. And he was a really good man. And so we started there, and I had 3 miscarriages, but then I did have my son. But then this pastor, there was church politics, and they thought he wasn't going along with the church politics, so they sent him somewhere else. And so we left that church too. Once again, we were without a church because all the church politics came in, and it got really ugly again. And so here we were kind of floating, and I threw myself into my businesses. My first husband had left me deeply in debt and had quit working. And so I had taken on all that debt because it was marital debt. I knew he wouldn't pay it off. So I threw myself, I started some businesses in insurance, and eventually first was working both in nutrition and in insurance full-time to pay off the debt. Once I got that paid off, I kept working in insurance and managed to work myself into a disability. And some of that was, I just didn't want to hear the pain in my own heart. I didn't really want to even hear my own thoughts. And some of that was because when our son was 2 years old, my husband became ill, and it was medical malpractice, but his health just spiraled. And after 4 years of it, it went to his pancreas, and he was in constant excruciating pain. Every day we were waking up, I would wake up just to see if he could manage the pain or if we needed to run to the emergency room. And so I was working, managing 2 businesses, running 2 businesses that I had started. I was consulting for a third. I was raising a little boy. I was handling everything in the home, and he was just holding on. And it was just that constant trying to care for him. And I was just exhausted and managed to, as I said, work myself into a disability. And I didn't even know how to call out to God, but somehow I still did. We weren't going to church at that time either, but I just felt something within me, and I knew that it was God saying, sit in that big chair every day and stare out the window for 1 hour. Don't read, don't do anything, just sit in silence. Well, I remember when I first tried that, 3 minutes went by. It was like, oh my gosh, because I had become, adrenaline had become my addiction of choice, and as long as I could keep working, I didn't have to hear or feel anything. I could just see success in my businesses and manage things. And after probably a few weeks, it was a few weeks of sitting in that chair, I remember feeling this tingling in my fingers and toes, and it just started creeping up my arms and legs. It was like, oh my gosh, what is this? And I recognized that God said to me, that's relaxation. And it was a brand new feeling for me. And after I continued, I started to hear and started to remember. I started to remember good things and beautiful things. And so it was a process. And it was during that process that I sensed that God was telling me to go and get answers for myself from the Bible and get it in the Greek and the Hebrew. Now that was a message for me. And at the time I said, well, they say I can't, they say I shouldn't. I don't know if I can. I don't know if the spark plugs will still fire, because at that point I was already in my 40s. And I had actually a fear of God moment, which was one of the most beautiful experiences, even though most people don't like the idea of fear of God. But I just saw myself standing before this great white light. And from this light came a voice saying, but what did I tell you to do? And I knew at that point that I had to go and get answers for myself. I'd been trying to get answers from other people, and I'd given up on so many people. I'd given up really on the church. But I knew that this actually was God speaking to me. And that's what led me to seminary. And I enrolled in an MDiv program, Master of Divinity program, at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Boy, that was when I learned about the term complementarian, egalitarian. And so, all this whole new levels of confusion came in, and I'm reading, trying to figure things out. I'd never heard of Calvinism and Wesleyanism and all this crazy stuff. But I just started digging in, and it was a hard process because also my husband's health continued to decline. And as his health declined, he also, of course, he couldn't really be nice anymore. And maybe he could have, but I was just like, God, I don't know where you are. And here I'm studying. I'm full-time student and working full-time in my businesses. During that time, my husband, in the ninth year of his illness, when our son was 11 years old, as I was starting the second year of the MDiv program, my husband took his life. And I know he's with God. I know he fought as hard as he could, but he gave up, and I can understand it. But it was, of course, very, very hard. And during the last 2 years of his life, when I had started in seminary, the person who I had trusted in my business and was trusting to do a lot of the running of the business had been taking money out of our client's premium trust fund account. And I didn't realize it. And so my husband passed, our son, 11 years old. He's just confused. And when he was by the time he was 13, I'd been trying to hold on to the businesses, but I discovered all of these, major losses in the business, and was trying to track it down and start a lawsuit. Anyway, I'll try to keep it short, but basically, the insurance carrier closed this one big plan that we had. I was facing up to 50 lawsuits. And I became the one that I had to personally fund claims for about 50 of the remaining clients that I couldn't find other insurance coverage for when we lost the one big plan that we had. So I knew that I was going to go financially. I was going to lose everything. And I remember when my son was 13, I let him know. And at this point, from the age of 2 to 13, all he had really known was chaos. And at that point, he said, "Mom, I think God's mad at us and he's abandoned us." And for the next 5 years, my son went as far away from the faith as he could. He just got as hard and cold toward God as he could. And I continued in the MDiv program, but I remember just crying out to God saying, I know the Bible says you love me, but for me, it's just a theological construct. I don't know that you love me. I need to know that you love me. And so in the process, I also knew that I wanted to go on for a PhD because I wanted to study the problem of evil. And again, I wanted to study it from the Hebrew. I wanted to study it from the book of Genesis. And so I kept on going. And in that summer, between finishing an MDiv and starting a PhD program, God got hold of me. And I had another encounter. I had an encounter with the love of God. I had a flashback. My whole life flashed before my eyes. And every evil and bad thing that had happened to me from my earliest memory up to that point, it was just the craziest thing. It was just this quick clip of scenes. But with every scene, every one that passed, I saw real so quickly, it was like, here's where that came in. Here's where that came in. But I also saw God catch me and pick me up and catch me on the other side and put me back. And for the first time in my life also, I no longer felt guilt, like, what did I do wrong? I must have done something wrong. It's got to be my fault. And, always beating myself up. I would have made a great old-time Catholic, crawling over glass, whipping myself and so forth. But all I felt instead, I just felt embraced by the love of God. And that really changed everything. And so then I did start in the PhD program. And as I was studying in the Hebrew, it's like, as I was going through, I would get to a point and all of a sudden just something would click. And it's like a scene from that my life passing before my eyes, is a clip from that. It'd say, here, this is where that came in. Here's the explanation for that. And so I went on this 6-year program in the PhD program of just learning about God. But I had so many questions because for couple of times in my life, both when I was in my first marriage and then when I was in my second marriage, when my husband's life was spiraling, I wanted to die. I remember being so jealous when I heard of somebody die. I couldn't go to the funeral because I'd say, why couldn't it be me? Why do I have to stay? But God used a few people in my at the seminary and a couple of close friends to just come around me. But I learned to ask the hard questions. And I remember one especially important time when my son also was in complete rebellion and just angry against the world. And I went in and locked myself in my bathroom, even though there was nobody home, and just started yelling at God and saying, "You're not helping me." I shook my fist at heaven and I told him, "You're a terrible father and you could be doing more to help me here. And why have you left me?" And I just let it all out. And I didn't know you could do that. I still hadn't really learned that it was okay to question God, much less confront him. And I said, "Well, you knew what I was thinking anyway, so now I said it." And there was just this silence. But the next morning, I heard God say, "I want you to believe in my son." And my response was, "Are you kidding? There's nothing to believe in." He had dropped out of high school. And he said I can share all these things. He was on drugs. Just his whole life was, I had to kick him out of the house before he was 17 because his friends were stealing what little I had left. And there was just no respect. And for 2 weeks, every morning, the Lord just woke me up and said something, just spoke to me, showed me something in his word. There was in Isaiah 54 was especially important. It says, "All my children will be taught of the Lord, and great will be the shalom, the wholeness of my children." And after 2 weeks, I began to have peace that my son was going to be okay. I wasn't waking up worried that, that I'd hear that he was dead in some gutter somewhere. And he came back home and just for some food, he was in the kitchen and his back was to me at the sink. And he said, "Mom, do you believe in me?" And I knew at that moment God had prepared me. And I said, "Yes, I do. And I know that everything that we've been through, every loss that we've had, you're going to see God turn it around, and we're going to see good come into our lives, even out of all this mess and horror and chaos that we've ever known." And he got tears in his eyes for the first time in 5 years. And he said, "Thank you, Mom, because if you don't believe in me, how could I believe in myself? You know me better than anyone." So my son also really seriously had deconstructed his faith. And we continue to process these things. So it's been a journey. I'll stop there. But I have questioned and challenged everything. And so I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have.
Ingrid, thank you for your story. We've heard a lot of stories on Dot Church. This is one of the most dramatic and inspiring, and I'm sure that there's a number of people on the call that can't believe you're still with the faith at all. Mm-hmm. So your story that you're still with it, you're still with God, you're still with Jesus is incredible, and it's also inspiring, to I'm sure a lot of people on the call. I wanted to ask you, that first encounter you had with that student, where you really felt like you were encountering God face to face, and that encounter was important during your whole story, Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit more about that person. Was it anything she said? Was it, describe how God showed up in that person's life?
I don't remember a thing that she said. I don't remember anything that was said that whole evening, but I just knew that when I looked in her eyes, a love. And, certainly it was her love for me, but beyond that, I recognized that it was God's love. And, it's, and that was something I could never shake. And I also had that evening, I just wept before I heard God speak to me. And I had this bitterness. Matter of fact, the next morning, my sister used to tell me, when I was 16, she said, "You're going to die of old age by the time you're 25." And I wouldn't respond, but I remember thinking, I sure hope so. But that next morning, I had somehow just that love, that encounter with love, genuine, without anything to gain, was enough to transform my life. And so when I went through that years later, when it was like, "God, I know you love me, but it's just a theological construct," I was praying that for years. It was the prayer at the end of Ephesians 3 that I'd know the love of God that surpasses knowledge. So I believe the most important thing that we can do and that we need to encounter is love, because the world can't manufacture it. There's no substitute and there's no counterfeit for it. And so we need to find people who love us without anything to gain. And we need to be those people also to those that we encounter. So for me, that's the most important thing. How can I love well?
Have you stayed in touch with that person? Does that person realize the impact that they had?
No, All I remember is her first name. And again, my life kind of went crazy. I just know it's someday I'm going to meet her again. All I know is that her name was Donna from Wheaton College.
Wow.
Yeah.
So much of your story has these direct, direct is in quotes, but encounters with God.
Mm-hmm.
The point where he said he wanted you to sit in silence for, a period of time on that chair, and a number of other, encounters that you mentioned. What would you say to Christians who really haven't felt that,
Mm-hmm.
where it's still a kind of a theological construct, it's an idea, it's a thought, but they haven't had that, like kind of unmediated contact with God? What would you say?
Yeah, and that's a big question, but we have such a noisy world. People are usually plugged in. People are so uncomfortable with silence. And this generation, these last couple generations more so than ever. And so I think it's so important to just take time in silence and to listen, to actually listen, because I believe that God wants to speak to all of us. And that and sometimes again, for 3 years, I was praying this prayer, but it was like, I wasn't going to give up. It was kind of like Jacob, I'm not going to quit until you bless me. And I had those, I remember another time when I had this imaginary cliff in my living room, and I was standing at the edge of this imaginary cliff, and I realized I could just step over that cliff into insanity and never have to take care of myself again. Just one step, and I could just go crazy, and someone else would have to take care of me the rest of my life. And so I had to very consciously step back from that cliff. I've done that thing a few times. It's like, do I drive off of this bridge, or do I just live another day? And so sometimes my first advice is, especially when you're at that point, is just live another day. It just don't quit. My theme song is the Chumpawampa song back from I think the 80s or something. I get knocked down, but I get up again. Nobody gonna keep me down. And so sometimes it's like, you just live another day. And one of the other really key things that helped me through was just finding something to be thankful for. And, people of the world know that too. It's a basic tenet of life, but just find something to be thankful for each day. And I remember my 7-year-old son saying, when I was in the pit of despair, and he sat me down and said in his most serious voice, one of the most profound things that I've ever heard and that has sustained me, he said, "Mom, we have to laugh at least once every day, even if you have to tickle me." And I mean, some of these just basic core things at the end, just find, so even if you have to laugh at someone else's expense, just don't tell it. I mean, just find some beauty, find something redeeming, find something to be thankful for, find something beautiful, and find something that will actually bring just even a little speck of joy into your life, just to make it to the next day. And then look for people in your life look for someone in your life where you can see love in them, and get rid of the people in your life that are just sucking the life out of you, especially when you need to heal. Just make those changes.
That's so helpful. At one point you talked about the whole Jesus People movement that you were a part of.
Yeah.
And then these folks came in and kind of squashed that and, pushed that down, and they were very authoritative and that type of thing. And you submitted to that because that was your mindset. That was your, part of, like you said, how you're raised in your culture. What advice would you have for Christians within a congregation to respect authority, but not be trampled by it? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I believe that that we need to listen to hear our heart, because even science has proved now we really have two minds. We have the logical mind, but our heart has a mind too, and these communicate with each other, just like we have two sides of our brain and they communicate with each other. So if we're just all logic and all strict, just do what you're told to do, and everything has to make sense, we're going to make some bad decisions. Somewhere we find that there's always that dynamic tension between the logic and, this just doesn't feel right. Somewhere between there, some will fall on one side of that fence or the other. It would just go by feeling, and won't but somewhere in between there. And that's why finding somebody that you can trust, somebody that seems to have their life, at least a little more together than you do, and has something positive where you can bounce some things off. But but yeah, again, people are going to fall on one side or the other of this whole obey thing, but there's times you just got to get out. If you can feel it sucking the life out of you, you might not do it immediately. You might just start going a little less while you're starting to look for but just say, where can I find life? Because we need to choose life. And choosing life is a big deal. We have to make conscious choices that will be life-giving, and that can be very practical. There's all kinds of practical as well as spiritual, but sometimes it starts out really practical.
Great advice.
Definitely. I have a question someone sent in to me. First, they said, thanks for sharing your story. They want to know, how do you navigate challenging times now, knowing what you've gone through and the support you've found in your faith? Are there strategies you use regularly to remind yourself to be thankful each day, journaling, prayer, etc.?
Absolutely. And that's a great question. And matter of fact, right now I'm writing a book on navigating evil. It'll be with InterVarsity Press. And it's the practical outworking of the academic work I did on evil in Genesis. And, but yeah, I have, some of the things that I practice. It's, I just call it mental hygiene. We clean our bodies every day, but we don't often clean our minds. And so I pay attention to the thoughts that I have. And so I learned from one of the things that I love is from, old Jewish practice. They have modéani, the giving thanks. So before you get out of bed, you're supposed to lay in bed and just be thankful, and so I will do that as a practice. Before I get out of bed, I'll just think of anything and everything I can be thankful for. And it includes being thankful for the hardships that I'm going through. In a song that was made to this, thankfulness prayer, it says, thank you for the struggles and the hardships that I'm going through, because I believe that even these will turn out for my good. Now that's a statement of will. It's not a just, giving up to destiny, but I've become, so when I lose my peace, I've learned to enter into a peace, and I've determined not to lose that. And so when something does shake me, something does blow at me, and, then I will take time and just enter back into that place of thanksgiving and just say, okay, what can I do? Because we have authority and responsibility. God, it's, that's a whole thing I wrote a book about, but we have authority and responsibility. And so often we don't realize the authority and responsibility that we have as human beings, and the importance of what we say and what we do with our minds, and that we can actually be part of changing situations. And it may take some grit and gut. Sometimes we need to back out, but yeah, but that thankfulness is such an important part, and that belief that, again, the Chumpawampa song, it's a secular song, but hey, I get knocked down, but I get up again. I'm not going to stay. Once the Lord spoke to me in Psalm 23, I was going through a hard time. And, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's a good verse. And then all of a sudden it was like, just in my spirit said, the operative word for you is through. Don't set up camp in the valley of the shadow of death. Don't lay down there. Go through it. Don't fear anything, because that's the other big thing. Fear is the biggest enemy we've got. And so when I see something that I'm afraid of, and I used to be afraid of everything from heights to darkness to whatever, and I'm going to face that fear and say no, because fear is never good. Fear is never from God. So if there's something that I'm afraid of, it's probably the worst thing for me. So I'm going to attack it now. So now when I see something that I'm afraid of, it's like, oh, no, you don't, and now I'll come against it. Whereas I used to just run. So that's another strategy. It's like, no, fear, no. I will not give you permanent place in my life. And I'm not going to lay down in the valley of the shadow of death.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Don't set up camp.
Yep,
That's a really great,
yeah.
great image. No, we have another one. They said, we are so blessed to have you here, Ingrid. Thank you for your story. Do you find that you carry anger or malice towards the church as an organization? What has helped you stay in a church as an establishment?
One of the things that helped me the most is recognizing that Jesus was killed by the religious establishment. So those that were the most trained and the most highly qualified were the ones that got him killed. And so I figure, well, that's just to be expected then, because he said, and so did they kill all the prophets that went before them. And so in church history, we see so often it is the establishment, because a religious spirit wants to kill anybody that doesn't obey it. So if it's simply a power structure, God somewhere left the house. And so I have come to not be surprised and almost expect it, but I'm always looking for where is that place where people are laying down their lives, where they're not competing for the light, where they're not performing, but they're looking to be transformed themselves and are looking to work with others and not hold the spotlight.
Yeah, definitely. Another great question from James, actually. Thank you so much for sharing. We're blessed to have you. I have a couple questions. So I'll start with the first one. If you could visit your past self at any one of these points of deep suffering, which would you choose and what would you tell yourself?
You mean as far, do you think that means what point of how far back would I go?
Yeah, at which point during maybe one of your deconstruction moments, like any point during your past?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I can't really answer that is because each of those moments of despair was because of some brokenness in me or some lie that I had believed. And so in the process of working through each one, lies were exposed and healing has taken place. And so, I mean, I would have loved to have just, come out of the womb a totally whole person and heard from God. And, but, we're all born into various degrees of brokenness. And, there are those who've had it, I've heard some stories that are far worse than mine because, I've got a lot of friends who go through stuff. We have these conversations. But I think, we're at whatever point we are, I'm actually so excited. Again, I wanted to be dead by 25. I was jealous of funerals. And now I'm looking, Lord, I got to live to 120 because there's so much I got to do. There's so much I want to know and experience and stuff, so it's, so each step is just part of a process. And I'm going to be learning my whole life.
Oh, that's great. He also asked, you mentioned pursuing the problem of evil. Do you feel you've received an answer?
I have received a lot of answers. That's the best way to describe it, because it's obviously it's not a simple answer, and the way evil is used in Scripture is not the way we typically use it. Because I remember even the former CEO of Google, where their ethics used to be, don't be evil or don't do evil. And there was an interview where he said, well, there's really not a, set definition of evil except for like maybe the Bible or something, so that's what he said. And so so that was also, it's like, okay, what is it? And so basically, and again, it's used broadly, but the simplest way is evil is basically anything that violates the creation good and covenant good. It's anything that is different than God's perspective as well, which, so how do you get God's perspective? So it just, so it's again, a lot to unpack, but yeah, it's, when something hits me now, I have a framework to be able to say, okay, where might this have come from? Is this something I did or where? So I have these, I call the agencies of evil. And so, is it natural? Is it, malevolent forces? Is it, is it action consequence? So I have this framework that I can work through and that'll help give me direction. Okay, now what do I need to do in this situation?
Ingrid, you mentioned in your talk that there are some things that the church doesn't tell you up front. What did you mean by that? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing is that I was not taught that there will be suffering in this world and that we won't get instant answers. It was like, come and be a Christian, God will solve all your problems. Well, it sure wasn't that easy. I came to God and sometimes my problems got worse. I started in seminary and my problems got way worse, so so I think that would be the first thing there, of course, a lot of other things we could share too, but I think to expect that hardship, and Jesus did say, in this world, you will have tribulation. That's hardship, pressures. We're going to have them, but we haven't helped each other do what you guys are doing here. Help. What happens when everything hits the fan and then it comes back and slaps us in the face, so we need to be able to be honest. We need to be able to ask any question of each other, of the church, of God. and of ourselves even, and not be afraid. God isn't afraid of any of our questions. He just says, bring it on. And the fact that the nation of Israel was named after Jacob wrestling with God, the one who wrestles with God. God named the entire nation that. So I believe that God so that God is honored when we wrestle with him and contend with him and strive with him and say, I'm not going to let go till you bless me. You know, it's like, I believe that he honors that.
Do you feel like that the evangelical church is getting better at that in terms of like giving people the safety and freedom to ask questions and to challenge and to, this whole deconstruction thing is kind of a hot trend right now, but do you think it's something more than just a hot trend, that there's actually a shift happening?
I think it's so necessary because the church has become irrelevant. During the pandemic, everyone was, they were hiding. And where was the voice of the church? And I, I mean, I have to include myself in that too. I wasn't trying to hide. I was trying to do what I could, but yeah, I believe that the church needs to be. People started to think church is a building, and they forgot that the church is people who are putting God in the middle and just being honest. It's there's a psychologist, Dr. Diane Langberg, who said trauma is the mission of the 21st century. And so, because we've just come in and be happy clappy and everybody put on a happy face, we have totally failed so many people in the church. So that's got to change. We've got to be a place where it's like, and you can't do that in a mega church. You can't do that with, hi, how are you? What's your name? Everybody sit down and now face forward and watch the big person on the screen. It's got to be small groups like what you're doing. And that has not happened sufficiently at all.
We're getting kind of close to the end of our time, which went really fast, which is sad. I kind of wish I knew you back in the 90s. We were in a church where I could have used your advice, but
I didn't have it then.
That's true. If folks were going to remember one thing from tonight, if they forgot everything else, is there one message that you would want to leave us with, something we shouldn't forget?
Yeah, I think just be completely honest with God. Almost a third of the Psalms are lament Psalms, and we've ignored that. So it's, wherever you're at with God, just, it's like any relationship, just be honest and just, tell God what you think, tell him off if you need, just be honest until you get the answers that you want. And find people, groups like this where you can ask the hard questions and just say, what about this? And, I've got a friend who, a couple times she would call and say, I hate God, and in the past I would be like, oh no. And it's like, tell me more, let's talk about it. So, yeah. So just take God on.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
He can take it. Yep.
I love that. Just to wrap things up, you mentioned a couple of your books. Where can people find your work so that they can read it? Yeah, well,
I don't have a lot of it out yet. I do have some videos on YouTube and stuff, but so at Amazon, if you were just plug in my name, you can see the two books. One is just a book kind of for parents who have kids, and then the others, the academic work. And again, right now I'm working with InterVarsity Press to write a book on navigating evil. So hopefully within the year that'll be out too. So yeah.
Awesome. Where else can people find you on social media? You mentioned YouTube.
Yeah, you can. I've got, there's different videos on YouTube. Other than that, I'm on Facebook. I am on Twitter, but I don't post much yet because I'm just still kind of, learning it actually. It's like, I am on Instagram, but I almost never post. So once in a while on Twitter, I've got some stuff on Facebook. But that's a place, or you could just hit follow on Amazon and that'd let you know when my book comes out. So
that's awesome. Great. Yeah, because we want to follow up. I know I want to read the one about evil. So
thank you.
I'm excited. But thank you again so much for being willing to come here and just share your story with us. I know it was a huge encouragement to me, and I'm sure to many others. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Taylor, who's going to close us in prayer.